Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry, and I'm joined as ever by Brandon Tessers, LCPC, I'm going to get this wrong, licensed clinical and professional counselor.
Doesn't matter. Every state has different acronyms and titles. It's all therapist is the word everybody knows.
Yeah. But this is not therapy, and we should stress that from the outset. It's
Definitely.
good to see you.
To see you too.
Just a little bit of housekeeping for anybody watching. Effective Artistry is a therapy practice and coaching practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. You're licensed to practice therapy anywhere in the state of Illinois, and for coaching
Our staff
services,
therapist. Yep.
yeah. And for coaching services, we can work with people anywhere in the world. This is not therapy. It's an open conversation, a chance for people to ask questions of Brandon. And I'll be asking Brandon a lot of questions during this hour. We do have a topic every week we discuss. So we have a topic for today, but if you're in the chat and you want to take the conversation in another direction, you take priority. So feel free to jump into the chat if you're here and ask us anything you want to ask. Today's topic is an interesting one. It's self-sabotage. So we've got a few questions already. And I'm just going to pull them up. So the first one, I guess the obvious one to start with, Brandon, is what is self-sabotage?
Well, so what? And I'll say off the top, I'm feeling much better, but I am still not fully recovered, and I assume people can hear that my voice is different, but maybe not. Maybe it sounds relatively similar on the outside. It feels very different to me.
It sounds a
Um,
little bit different. So if you need to stop, I can I can witter on if needed.
I'll just have you vamp. No, I'm doing okay, and I've been able to kind of get through meetings. I had no voice on Saturday, but
Oh,
a bit of a voice now. I wouldn't be able to break out into show tunes like I normally do, but um,
sorry,
no,
everybody.
yeah, self-sabotage. So again, this is one of those constructs, right? Like it's
Right.
not a thing that happened. It's not something that exists independent of us talking about it, meaning it's just a way to describe certain things. And it's what it says on the label. It is when a person is sabotaging themselves. As a concept, as a construct, it's one that we utilize, not everybody, but when we utilize it, we're talking about, oh, somebody either states that they want or seems to want or does want a certain thing, but they behave in some way that makes it harder for them to get it. Like you want this new job and you don't show up to the interview. We would call that self-sabotage. Or you're in a happy romantic relationship and you start picking fights until you break up. We would call that self-sabotage. But I think it's really important to note that this is just a way of telling stories about what's happening. We could
Yeah.
describe both of those things in a million other different ways. So all these pop culture, like pop psychology terms, I want to be clear that they're useful to the extent that they're useful, but it's not like I have self-sabotage in me, like I have a genetic predisposition to self-sabotage or anything like that. It's just a way of saying like, why would I do this when it loses me what I want or makes it harder to get what I want or gets me something I don't want or whatever. One way of saying that is, oh, I'm sabotaging myself. It's just like a shorthand phrase, really, because it
Yeah.
still even provide a possible explanation as to why, like some of the other constructs do. Like some of the other things we've talked about would say, this is happening because this. Self-sabotage isn't even that. You'd still have to ask, like, well, why am I sabotaging myself? It's just a faster way to say I am behaving in ways that appear to be against my own self-interest.
Right. So is it safe to say it's not a listed symptom for any particular condition?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
definitely.
Is it
I
more
mean,
common in some conditions than others? Or
I mean, you could say that, but there's not really, again, because we can't research it, right? Like
yeah,
we can't we can't clinically identify what is or is not self-sabotage. So there's not a way to say. We could make guesses and say things like it's probably more likely for people who have ADHD, for example, but that would only be because we could say that people with ADHD are more likely to struggle with executive dysfunction and therefore behave in ways that cause them problems. And then we could call those things self-sabotage if that was useful.
yeah. That's actually answered a question I was going to ask, which is, well, how do you know if it's self sabotage or executive dysfunction? What difference does it
It
make?
it can be both.
Yeah,
Self-sabotage, that's kind of like saying, how do you know if it's a cake or a dessert? Like
yeah.
it just depends on what you're finding it useful to call it.
Hmm.
And self-sabotage is one of those, like, I think there's a lot of like pop psychology concepts from, I'd say, like the 80s, 90s, they got really popular, even the 70s too, that like at this point are just accepted as like, oh, that is definitely a thing, not somebody's idea. Like delayed gratification is something, that a concept that was first developed in the 70s. And now we talk
Uh,
about it as though it's just a thing about being human, right?
yeah.
Um, so it kind of comes back from that, same as like enabling and codependency and a lot of those things that have been in the zeitgeist for 30 or 40 years now.
Hmm. And those things take on different meanings, I guess, as they kind of percolate down
Yeah.
to the community. Yeah.
And as always, the utility in it is having language helps you to identify things in a particular way. So if you
Hmm.
think of yourself as somebody who sabotages themselves, you're more likely to notice yourself doing something that you would consider to be self-sabotage, and thereby say, oh, there I am, I'm sabotaging myself again. And then identifying for yourself what actions to take at that point, because whenever I start sabotaging myself, it helps if I blank. So we could call it literally anything. Fwubadaga, that's my go-to like made up word. If you label some pattern of behavior that you notice in yourself that you want to change, fwubadaga, then you're more likely to notice it and be like, oh, here's fwubadaga again. And whenever I fwubadaga, I know I need to do this thing next because that helps.
I really like that. I'm going to come up with my own word for that. I was thinking about this topic today. I don't want to call him boyfriend because we're old now, but my partner noticed that I had a habit of, in the early stages of the relationship, of overthinking all the things that could go wrong and all the reasons he'd be better off with somebody else. He called it drilling holes in the boat. So that's what I think of now. I don't do it anymore. I like the boat.
Good. Yeah, well, I mean, that is just thinking. That's what
Yeah,
cognition is. Like,
yeah,
because you're not actually drilling holes in the boat. What you're doing is saying, hmm, it seems like maybe some water is getting in from somewhere, and where would that be? You're imagining holes in
yeah,
order to save it, right? Like
yeah,
if you didn't enjoy it, you wouldn't think so much about what might come along that could ruin it or what problems might arise. You're thinking about those things, as the brain always does, to try and prepare you so that you can head them off at the pass, or that you'll be prepared and know what to do when they happen. But
yeah.
yeah, we
It's like
do
running.
sometimes think too much and it causes problems in and of itself.
Yeah, it's like running simulations, I guess. Um, but
Exactly.
um, the reason I bring it up is because sometimes I wonder if that becomes self fulfilling prophecy, and is that a form of self sabotage? If you keep
Well,
focusing on the negative, then
yeah, and we have
yeah,
a comment in the chat there from my dad, actually. Hi, Dad. Asking the same thing. Is self-fulfilling prophecy really a thing? Do we manifest our greatest fears and behavior that will produce the undesired result that we fear, or is it the true desired result? So first thing I'll say is desire is conscious, meaning you don't have secret desires from yourself. The only exception to that rule, the only thing that the non-conscious portion of you wants, is to persist, to survive, and to set yourself up well for future continued survival.
mhm,
So it is possible that there are times that the thing that you consciously want Like my son uh, earlier this year was watching videos of people doing like parkour and flips and stunt moves and stuff like that. And he stood up on the fireplace. It's only like a foot and a half off the floor, the little mantle thing or whatever. And he was doing this jump. I didn't know what he was doing. He throws on, and he's like, Dad, I'm trying to jump and land on my like stomach and like land flat on the ground, but my body won't let me. And so,
Mm.
yeah, that's a good example of you have conscious desire to do a thing that you think would be cool, and your body's like, no, no, this is going to hurt. We're not going to do that. Now, in this particular case, his body was right, and his conscious desire was a bad. He would have been very hurt if he tried to lay flat. There's a reason that your body won't let you do that. But sometimes is wrong. Sometimes it's the other way. That the conscious desire is something that will actually be beneficial for you, but your body's saying, no, 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 we're not. That's bad, right? So if we're talking about desire, what is a desire? You're talking about what your conscious desire is. If you are behaving in other ways, it's either executive dysfunction, meaning that what it is that you need to do in order to achieve the thing that you're desiring, something is missing there. You don't know, or it costs more than the resources you have available, or something. Or
Mhm.
your brain and your body are reacting instinctually as this is dangerous. I don't care that you consciously want it. It's dangerous. We're not doing it.
Okay.
That's it. But separate from that, self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I just wanted to, people do this all the time. Same, especially with self-sabotage. Like, do I really want to fail? No, no. Sometimes you fail because we all fail sometimes. We fall short, we miss things, we make mistakes. Sometimes you fail because the thing you want, your brain and body says, no, that's dangerous. You don't want to fail, you just want to survive, right?
Mm.
Like sometimes you're working a job that's asking you to work 100 hours a week, and consciously you're saying, I want to keep going at this, I want to keep going at this, I want to do well, I'm going to get a promotion. And you just start oversleeping and missing things and whatever. We could call that failure because you're trying to do more than you're capable of doing in a sustainable way. Or we could also say that even though your conscious idea is that this is a good thing for you, you've been tricked and brainwashed into believing that something that's actually harmful and dangerous for you might be good. And we can override that stuff, which gets weird. But anyway, self-fulfilling prophecy, again, another construct, just means because you're about something happening, somehow that contributes to the thing happening. So do self-fulfilling prophecies work? I mean, do they happen? Yeah, because sometimes you're worried about a thing happening because of reasons, and those reasons do actually result in the thing happening, but you're watching for it, you're paying attention. And so then you're like, see, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it was
Yeah.
going to happen. But you might have had a sense that it was going to happen because you saw the markers that it was going to happen. You didn't make it happen. There is something that we call perception checking, which is, sorry, I'm going to drink my tea more frequently.
Go for it. I'll join you.
Think of it like, I'm not going to use my standard example because it involves DNA and like weird things that people don't generally know about. Any given moment, there is way, way more, like for all practical purposes, infinitely more that you could be aware of, that you could perceive than whatever things you are aware of. And we have processes, we talk about this all the time. We have processes that dictate of all of the stuff that you could be aware of, which includes things from the physical environment detected through the senses, but also includes your imagination and your memory and things that you can develop through cognition. So I'm saying for practical purposes, it's infinite. You could come up with anything and think about anything. And those processes that dictate what do we notice and what is a lower priority, that it would be great to also notice that and pay attention to that, but we just don't have room because this other stuff's more important. Well, that gets filtered in a lot of different ways. And one of the things we talk about with perception checking is mood, meaning if you're angry, you are going to prioritize noticing the things that are worth being angry about. If you're sad, you're going to notice the stuff that is worth being sad about. So you might be in a room, and I'm way oversimplifying here, but you might be in a room in which there's 10 things that would piss you off and 10 things that would depress you and 10 things that would excite you and 10 things that would scare you. And if you're scared, you're going to notice the 10 scary. And if you're excited, you're going to notice the 10 exciting, and so on. Now, that happens more with negative experiences because those negative emotional experiences, part of what's baked into it is the desire for it to stop. If I'm angry, if I'm scared, if I'm sad, I don't want to be those things. I want to resolve it. So I'm doing everything that I can do, some of that non-consciously, right? My body is regulating things and whatever to try and get that resolved and be able to move on to something else. But consciously, to whatever extent I'm trying to resolve it. Otherwise, in other words, if you all of a sudden got mad and you don't know why, you weren't thinking about something that made you mad, it's just out of nowhere you feel mad.
Mm.
Usually the next thing you're going to do is say, why am I mad all of a sudden? And then you start thinking about, well, could this have made me mad? No. Could this have made me mad? No, I'm not mad about that. Could this have made me? Yeah, that I'm pissed about. That, you filter through things until you find the stuff that justifies the way that you're feeling, not because you want to feel it, but because you want to stop feeling it.
Yeah.
You got to know what it might be that's causing it. And can that produce self-fulfilling prophecies? Yeah. Because if you're feeling bad about yourself in a relationship, then you're going to be watching out for, or at least disproportionately watching out for, prioritizing anything that would happen that would justify you feeling bad about yourself.
Yeah.
And you're going to notice less any of the stuff that would justify, that would not, like, that would say, no, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself. So jealousy is a very common example of this. Like, does this person really not like me? Maybe this is part of what you said, you're thinking about how you could be better off with someone else, or you like that you start to think like, no, I don't, this person's so great, and that this person's so great and they're so wonderful gets turned into, uh-oh, what if I'm not great enough to keep them around? And it'll really hurt when they leave because they're so great and I love them so much. And now I'm going to focus in on what are the things about me that might be a shortcoming. Like maybe he's just confused and thinks I'm cool when really I'm not. But let me start to think about that. Or maybe no, he's being too nice to me. And that doesn't make sense because I'm telling myself that he's awesome and I'm terrible. So why would he be so nice? Maybe he's cheating on me, or maybe
Oh,
whatever. And
yeah.
then you start to worry, and then you start to see, why did he put his phone away when I came in the room just now? Where if you're not worried about cheating, you might not even notice that at all. And if you did, you probably wouldn't be like, he's being secretive or whatever.
Yeah.
You would think, oh, you just put it away because I came into the room and he wants to pay attention to me now or whatever. So it does guide your perception, and then that guides your mood and your behavior. Thoughts, feelings, and actions are all linked to each other. And so then you start getting real, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Blah, 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 and accusatory and whatever. And then it does ruin the relationship. And the person is like, yeah, okay, I don't want to do with this. But yes,
Hmm.
it happens. But it's not because you want it, it's because you're afraid of it. And yes, if we lose track of the fact that what we're thinking about is just what we're thinking about, doesn't mean that it's real. You can have a fear that someone is cheating on you, doesn't mean that they are or that they aren't. Just
Yeah.
like you can have no concern and be confident that a person would never cheat on you. And it doesn't mean that they are or they aren't. What's happening in reality and what you're thinking about are separate things. Some of us, especially those of us who think a lot and are very smart and neurodivergent people and all, we not, I mean, we all do it to some extent sometimes, and some of us just do it more. That we get confused and start to be convinced that because I'm thinking a thing, that means that there must be something real about it. Because I'm
Mm.
worried that I secretly have cancer, that probably means that I do, and I'm just picking up on something. Because I'm worried that cheating on me, that probably means that he is, and I'm picking up on something.
So,
If you can keep those separate, it helps.
yeah. So if you've had a history of, I don't know, bad things happening in your life, you're more likely to be on the lookout for more bad things happening in future, right?
Yeah, well, I would say everybody's had bad things happen because
Yeah.
bad things is proportional. So
Yeah.
if I have bad things, but I think a useful way to look at that is that you're more likely to be on the lookout for things that have happened or been relevant in your life in the past. And
Mm.
that's not just in terms of, oh, I was hit by a car once, so now I'm very nervous and hypervigilant around cars. It can also be about solutions, meaning like people will talk about hypochondria or whatever, right? Like especially when it comes to chronic fatigue and chronic pain symptoms or syndromes or disorders. Some people will say, oh, it's all in your head. You're just over focusing on your pain. Really, your pain is the same as anybody else's pain. You're just making it a bigger deal than it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, this isn't part of the point I was trying to make, but just say it real quick. First of all, even if that's the case, that's valid. Pain, that's what pain and fatigue are. They're signals that you pick up on. And how would you know if one person's is the same as another person? If their system is more sensitive to it, if their brain is more sensitive to it, and they pick it up in a more intense way, that's the exact same thing as having more pain and more fatigue. So that's a ridiculous statement to make in the first place. But also, let's say that you are somebody who all life you've really struggled, right? Like growing up, everybody else just seemed to be able to do things that you couldn't do. Everyone else seemed, now whether that's true or not, or other people are hiding it, or it's your percent, is not the point here. Just you have this sense of I am I am more tired than I should be, or I'm in pain and it's bothering me or whatever. And then after years and years and years of dealing with that and being bothered by that and thinking about that, all of a sudden you get diagnosed. Oh, you have X, Y, or Z.
Mm-hmm.
And then they give you a treatment for X, Y, or Z and it makes it better. Well, yeah, the next time that you start feeling bad or weird, whether it's cognitively or emotionally or physically or anything, of course, you're going to be more likely to say, maybe I have something again. Maybe there is something here that if I get diagnosed and they treat it, it'll get better. And it may or may not be the case. But yeah, when bad things happen to you, you're more likely to notice that kind of bad thing again because it's survival. But also, when good things happen to you, when things help you, you're more likely to focus in on those specific types of help again, even at the cost of missing other potential types of help.
Right.
There's
Got
a
it.
reason that people focus on medical issues for everything. Any perceived lack of anything, and they get into, ooh, what chemical supplement do I need or whatever. And it's that whether you're talking about like holistic supplements or Eastern medicine or Western medicine, whatever, once it helps you, it's why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you the next time you're struggling again and be like, I'm going to go check this again because that last time I futzed around forever and didn't find a resolution until I checked this. So I'm going to check that first.
And so if it doesn't work, hmm, then what?
Well, that's the problem is again, when people are getting their thoughts confused with an accurate depiction of reality. Because it's not that our thoughts are never accurate, of course. Like we all navigate the world in some level of functional way, right? Like if you are alive, you are functioning to some extent in some kind of a way. So I'm not trying to say nothing in here means anything. That's ridiculous. But you just keep in mind, like this is why we push so much that these things are just construct, right?
Yeah.
Or that we don't know, that we're just making guesses and everything is iterative. You come up with an idea, then you test it. That if something is useful to you, then it's useful to you. And we don't care whether someone would agree that that's the most accurate description of whatever thing is. Because what we're trying to get people to say is it is useful to think, but it gets really problematic if you get confused that what you're thinking must be based in reality instead of an idea of what reality might be. So, in other words, you would, excuse me, you've had big problems solved in the past by getting a medical diagnosis and treatment. Now you got a new big problem. Of course, you would start looking at medical diagnosis and treatment first. And if that doesn't work, you say, okay, well, this one isn't that then. There
Yeah.
are other things it could be. Just because the last one or several in the past or whatever had been resolved that way, even those things, like especially we're talking ADHD or depression, like any um, cognitive or affective kind of thing, even when they are helped by medical treatment, there's still other factors that could also be helpful on whatever. All of this is just what do you try first? And then if that doesn't work, what do you try next? Instead of if that doesn't crap, there's definitely something medically wrong with me. I got to figure it out. I got to go back to the drawing board and find the next medically wrong thing with me and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And not that that's never good either, because sometimes you go to the doctor and you think it's this thing and they test and it's not. but then you find out, oh, it's this other thing that you didn't think. So maybe you try for that too. But I always like the question, what matters here, right? Like if, for example, I'll use myself as an example because I have been anxious about medical issues a lot lately. If I'm finding that, man, I seem to be less energetic than I used to be. I seem to not be able to handle as many things as I used to handle. What's going on? And if I start by thinking maybe there's something medically wrong with me, I'm going to look into that and check into that. And I have, and I will continue to. But it's also possible that it's just because I'm getting older that energy goes down in a natural way. And even that would have biological mechanisms behind it. So, like as I'm getting older, maybe yes, as people age, their energy goes down because their whatever system stops functioning quite as well or whatever. That doesn't mean it's a disease necessarily. So the question is, what does it matter? Right? If I find something and there's a treatment for it, then okay, that would matter.
Yeah.
But if it's just like, here's a label for a thing, nothing really to do about it other than just know that that's how you are now. You get fatigued easier than you did when you were 20. Like, then it doesn't really matter that I know the exact mechanical function of it so much as it matters that I start to figure out how to change my life and my expectations and things around it.
Makes
So
that.
for me, with medical stuff at least, I mostly am focused on things that could be degenerative, like things that if I caught it and did something about it, could be resolved. But if I don't catch it or do something about it, it could get worse and worse, potentially even fatal and whatever. And if it's not one of those things, then at the end of the day, you just say like, okay, well, whatever. This is how I am. What do I do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it could be like maybe I start drinking more tea and that helps me get through there. Maybe I start doing yoga, or maybe I need to play games with my friends more frequently, or maybe I just need to sleep better or get myself a nicer mattress. There's so many, many things that you can try for almost any problem that you're experiencing. We just don't want people to get hyper focused on only one potential solution.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. And if the first thing doesn't work, try the next thing. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we get stuck in that pattern of, well, I can't try anything until I know that's the reason. And what does
Mm.
that mean? It means I'm going to think about everything. I'm not going to do anything until I know that what I'm going to do will work. And a lot of us get stuck in that pattern. Like, until I
Okay.
have the exact solution, I'm not going to do it. Like, a common one for young, like 17, 18-year-olds that I work with is they've been told all their lives that they got to pick the right school and study the right thing at school so they can have the right career. And people ask this question of 17 and 18-year-olds as though it's a normal thing to ask of like, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? I don't know. Who knows that? Who
I
knows
still
what they
don't
want to
know.
do? Right. Like I love my job. I still don't know that I'm gonna love it 5 years from now. Like
Yeah.
things change. But they accept the premise. They see everybody else just choosing schools and choosing majors. It's like, oh, I guess I'm supposed to know. And they force themselves to pick something. But it becomes so stressful. I forget why I started talking about this. Videos. Trying something.
Yeah.
That they'll get stuck. They'll say, like, well, if I'm told that I'm supposed to what I want to do for the rest of my life, then there must be some way for me to be able to know that. And I don't know that. So what am I doing wrong? And I'm not going to pick anything until I can figure out for sure that, yes, definitely I will like to be a teacher for my whole life. Definitely I will like to be a programmer or a doctor or whatever for my whole life. And so they just never pick anything.
Mm.
Or like a really like simple, like really low level version of this is my desk is a mess. I got to clean it up. And then I start thinking, well, where will everything go? Where will everything? And once I have it clean, how will I keep it clean? Like I need a new system. Before I actually start moving anything or addressing the thing that's bothering me, I got to like figure out a cognitive process of how to do it, how to make sure that it's never dirty like this again. And until I have stuff like that, I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah. That's interesting because that's a conversation I had with a coaching client recently. And And so we just decided we're going to start small. We're just going to do 3 minutes in whatever corner of the room and then walk away.
Yeah. One of the most common complaints that people will come in with is like, I suck at initiation, which I hate the construct of initiation as an executive function for this reason exactly. Because in real life, like, what is initiation? When do you ever initiate something? It's always transition. It's
Right.
always something came before, and now you're moving on to something else. It's never like out of the blue. So it's centering something that's identified as productive and ignoring all the contextual factors and what came before and blah blah blah. So I don't like it. But people will come in with that all the time. I'm terrible at initiation. How do I get better at initiating stuff? And they think they're hoping that there's some magic answer that isn't just some version of you just got to start.
Yeah.
Like, so that doesn't mean that it's like should be dismissed as, oh, people just lack motivation. Everything we do is working against that concept of motivation and laziness and blaming the individual. It just means that whatever interventions we're designing with them, or if you're doing this on your own, whatever ideas you come up with for yourself are just things that are designed to make it easier for you to start doing something. So a lot of that is like narrow scope, break it into small chunks is a very common piece of advice for this. But yeah, work for 3 minutes. Or you have a hard time getting yourself to write your papers. All right, well, sit down and write at least for 5 minutes. I don't care if it's gibberish. You just have to move your fingers across the keyboard.
Yeah.
It's anything that removes that pressure of how am I going to do this? How is it going to be right? Am I going to complete it? Or that thinking part of, oh gosh, I always suck at this. I'm going to suck at it again. I'm just going to waste my time. Why am I doing this? And blah, blah, blah. And just move your fingers. Does it always work? No.
No.
But that's what we need to. Sooner or later, if you're going to improve at initiating, it's going to be about getting yourself to be able to start doing something earlier than you otherwise would, which means start doing something before you've actually figured out how the whole thing will work.
So coming back to self-sabotage then, I know one of the reasons a lot of people say that they self-sabotage is fear of failure. So is it, I guess maybe sometimes it's just an inability to initiate, right? I
Could
didn't
be.
do this before, so I'm not going to be able to do it this time.
Yeah. And inability to initiate could also be described as a fear of failure. I'm not going to try it until I know I'll succeed or whatever.
Yeah.
And again, if the thing I'm struggling to get myself to do is a backflip, fear of failure, you should be afraid of failure. Like there
Yeah.
are consequences to failure and you should work those, not even should, you just do. You will, either consciously or not, work in the probabilities of failure and what will it cost you if you fail? What are you risking when you attempt something? There's nothing wrong with having a fear of failure. I don't know how, well, okay, I know how. It all comes back to capitalism and whatever, but figure of speech. I don't know how this became a thing that like we all talk about a fear of failure as though it's an unusual thing
Right.
and something that should be resolved. You shouldn't be afraid of failure. Now, some failures we fear disproportionately, of course. Like, oh, I don't know. I don't want to approach this person even though they seem cool. I don't want to go up to them because what if they don't like me or whatever. There are there are consequences of failure, of social rejection or whatever. But we do have brains and bodies that are wired differently, that are constructed for different environments than the ones that we're in. And so it is commonly the case that the actual consequences of getting rejected by some cool person you see at the bar or whatever is not proportionate to the way that you're responding as though it's life or death. Because I say this over and over to people, social rejection is equivalent to death for the way that your brain and body were constructed. For the vast majority of human history, if your group of people kicked you out, you died.
Yeah.
So our brains and bodies respond to it with that level of danger.
As if
And
it's physical
sometimes,
pain, right?
was that?
As if it's physical pain. It
Yeah,
becomes physical pain. Yeah.
yeah. And we're not even talking like millions and millions of years ago, right? Like there's a reason that in Shakespearean plays, like banishment is a fate worse than death. Like being cut off from your social support group, humans don't survive independently. We just don't. So either you find another one, which for the vast majority of human history was not a possibility. Like
Mm-hmm.
you couldn't just move one city over. There weren't cities, you know. And even over the last, recorded history, a few thousand years or whatever, as opposed to the millions of years over which we evolved, still like, okay, walk to the next town over where you know no one and have nothing, and like somehow, these days, not as big of a deal. And sometimes it is, right? Like there are relationships where to lose that relationship would be incredibly problematic for us,
Right.
emotionally, physically, cognitively, whatever, right? But there are a lot that wouldn't. Like, who cares if that kid made fun of me? Like, I don't need anything from him. It causes me no repercussions, blah, 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 whatever. So it is worth checking in and being aware of like, am I overly concerned about the fear of failure here? But you shouldn't not be afraid of failure. And there's nothing wrong with not doing something because you're afraid of failing. I am not going to attempt a backflip because I'm afraid of failing at that. And my gut sense is that it's overwhelmingly more likely that I will fail than that I will succeed. And the cost of failure is very high. And even if I do succeed, the reward for succeeding at that is pretty low. Like, I mean, I wouldn't shut up about it if I did a backflip out of nowhere. You'd hear me brag about it or whatever, but who cares? It is not always better to do a thing. It's not always better to attempt a thing. Sometimes the better option is to not do the thing.
Yeah.
And I think that does get confused for people a lot, where they're just assuming that doing it is better and therefore I'm deficient because I'm not doing it. They lose out on, no, maybe there are reasons that I'm not doing it. Maybe this doesn't really make sense to do the way that I'm trying to say that it does. I am glad that my son stopped trying to jump and land face first on the floor. I'm not like, oh, he's got to develop some more grit, some more oriented persistence or whatever, various different versions. Like, no, I wanted him to give up on that. I'm glad that he did.
Yeah. So is
Nothing
this
wrong with that.
something then that you can explore with people in therapy? The reasons
Absolutely.
behind the
And
self-sabotage.
in coaching, this one too, actually, like this is important because again, it's about how we label things.
Mm-hmm.
So if I label something that actually is rational, good behavior, like makes sense, serves a purpose. But if I don't look at it that way, I don't see the purpose that it serves, it doesn't, and I just label it as self sabotage or I label it as executive dysfunction, then I'm going to continue to feel terrible about my inability to do this thing. And I'm going to continue to be unable to do it. Or I'm going to somehow magically find a way to force myself to belly flop on the floor. And I'm going to break my nose and knock out 3 teeth and whatever. Like, yeah, we have to explore. This is why we do cost and value,
Right.
not just capability, because capability presumes that it is not worth investigating whether the thing should or should not be done, is beneficial or not to do, aside from the fact that it's static and, et cetera, those other things that we talk about, binary, which it's neither of those. Yes, we look at the cost and the value. Super common example of this, doing your homework early.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody thinks that they should. I should do my homework right when I get home from school. Or I should start working on that paper the moment I get the assignment, even though it's not due for 6 weeks. Nobody can explain why, because it's not actually better to do it that way. And I can explain why it's not better to do it that way, why it's better to wait and do it later. But if you just have an idea that waiting and doing it later is bad, that you're procrastinating, that you're struggling to initiate, then you get stressed and you feel terrible and you're miserable and it drains you of all these resources so that by the time you eventually do get around to doing it, now you're way more exhausted, struggling way more than if you had just said, yeah, no, it makes sense to wait and do it later. So we want to explore this stuff. And I challenge anybody to give me good reasoning why you should start working on a paper right when you get the assignment, even though it's not due in 6 weeks. There are some reasons for it. They're overweighed. And then you behave in the way that makes sense, but you think it doesn't make sense. So you judge yourself as being deficient.
What's that expression? Work expands to fill the time available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the problem expands to fit the time allotted to the problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, there are different ways of breaking it. Like, let's dive into this just as a practical example, because it is a common one. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, there are some things that it is beneficial to do earlier than later. Let's take our two examples, doing a paper that was assigned that's not due for 6 weeks and doing homework right after school. The stated benefit of doing homework right after school is because then it's done and I don't have to worry about it for the rest of the day,
Yeah.
which emphasizes the parents' role here because they're the ones that are worried about it until it's done. But then, of course, yes, you do start worrying about it until it's done. But if you do that, especially some of us who have this pattern of every day, I should do it at 4:15 when I get home. Every day I should do it at 4, and you never do, and you never do. You don't get around. Finally, you do it at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, and you just tell yourself that it's a pattern of I suck, I procrastinate, I'm bad at executive functioning, and or my favorite, by which I mean the most insidious, I'm motivated by stress. I only
Mm-hmm.
get things done if I feel like it's really stressful and urgent. Because a lot of those people, this is one of my most common early interventions, like before we get into exploring other stuff, is try giving yourself permission to do it at 8 or 9 or 10, whatever you normally do. Try just planning on that. Try assuming that it isn't actually good to do it at 4:15 and it is actually good to do it at 8, 9, or 10. See if you can get through the day without feeling stressed and terrible about yourself, and then see if you do it anyway. Because most of the time, you do.
Yeah.
Stress doesn't make things easier. It does things more important, more urgent. It does get us to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do, but it makes it much, much harder to do those things. Stress isn't a good thing. And why would it be better to do it at 8 or 9 or 10 p.m.? For the same reason that if you go run a marathon and you come home, I don't say, hey, stand up and cook dinner right now. If you absolutely have to cook dinner after you run a marathon, sit down and rest for as long as you can to let your body recover before you start pushing it to do other things. Why would you go to school all day where theoretically, at least, you're being taxed cognitively? You're being asked to do very difficult, draining academic, intellectual tasks in one class after another for 8 hours. And then we would say, good, and now do another hour's worth. Why wouldn't we say, good, now rest for 3 or 4 hours, then do the other hour's worth?
Right. This is something we've talked about before, the pressure that um, we're under in school as school kids that sometimes gets taken for granted. You know, you do a full work day and then you're expected to go home and do more.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you've never as an adult, had a situation where you have to do some work outside of work hours, which is terrible, and we should try not to do that, but we have to sometimes. And you've never been like, okay, I just got home, I'm stressed, let me just relax for a minute. Let me like
Right.
eat some dinner and drink a glass of wine and I'll get to it in a couple hours. Like, yes,
Yeah.
of course. The brain, this a lot of what I'm trying to do when I try and talk about like the science of the do all that psychoeducation stuff, talk about the science, the neuroscience and biology and all that stuff about what's people are experiencing, is because for some reason, cough capitalism, cough, but whatever. For some reason, people have become convinced that the brain is the only system in the body which does not rest. Like everything else, of course, we would say, yes, you just worked it really hard. There are limits. And if you continue to push yourself, you're likely to injure yourself. So stop and take a break. And even without the risk of injury, it gets harder and harder. Like do this if you're watching along right now. Hold your arm straight out to the side and don't put it down. Keep it out and don't put it down. And notice that as time goes on, and it will happen at different rates for each of us because we're all constructed differently and used to different things. But as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to keep that hand at the same position, right?
Yeah.
From the outside, the behavior looks the same. So I'm going to say, clearly you're capable of keeping your hand out if it's important enough to you. Sure. It doesn't change the fact that it is actually getting harder and harder and harder to do in ways that no one else can observe. And that sooner or later, no matter how important it is, I won't be able to continue to do it. But it becoming harder and harder eventually starts to progress into discomfort and pain. And I'm just going to lose the ability sooner or later. So if what we're saying is obviously you're capable of keeping your arm out, keep it out, keep it out. And then sooner or later they collapse and we're like, what are you doing? Like, systems are limited and the brain is not different.
I mean,
Just
there's a
like if
reason
you
we sleep,
go ahead.
right?
Yes. Actually, someone put it this way recently, which I thought was a really interesting way to put it. If an entire class of organisms spends a third of its life completely vulnerable to all forms of danger and predation, something important must be happening in that
Right.
time. We
Yeah.
would have evolved away from there is a strong selective pressure. If there was any benefit in sleeping less than we do, we would sleep less than we do.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need to be able to justify it. That's part of the problem, right? Like there's a part of what we're talking about was talked about very popularly about 10 or 15 years ago as a theory of ego depletion. Like the self-evident, we all observe this, that as I use my brain throughout the day, it gets harder and harder to do so. So for some reason we needed a theory for that. And it was called ego depletion, that there's some resource that it takes to be able to make yourself do stuff and you use it up and it gets depleted and it becomes harder and harder until you rest and restore. And now that theory of ego depletion is largely kind of discredited. Everyone says it's a bad, there's whatever. And the basis for that discrediting is that no one can prove the biological mechanism by which it happens. We all know it happens, we all experience it, but no one can say, well, if that was true, then there must be some physical observable resource in the body that gets diminished, and no one can point to what that is, as though that means that it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So we're accepting as the premise there that you don't get depleted, even though everybody does. And what purpose does that serve other than, again, to be able to say to people who are tired, no, you're not. Just push through.
Yeah.
So, of course, you should rest. And yes, the problem expands to fit at the time. Now, again, starting early does have it. I'm not trying to pretend like it's never good to start early. The benefits of starting early, number one, and this one people will throw out there most commonly when they're trying to justify it, is you never know what's going to happen later. Like, sure, maybe I think this is something that's only going to take me a day or two to get done and I have 6 weeks. But if I wait until the last day or two, what if I'm sick in that last day or two and I can't get it done and I've run out of time? Or what if when I go to do it, it turns out that it actually takes a lot longer than I thought, or I need something that I can't get quickly or whatever? And that's true. So it is worth, and I talk with people about this, it's worth like looking into it early to make sure that you do understand everything that you need to do, that you do have available to you all the resources that you'll need. You don't want to like need books from the library and not find out until the library's closed and it doesn't open again until after it's due. So that's one. You want to make sure to minimize how much stuff is going to come up unexpectedly that would change how long it takes you. Another is that we make incorrect guesses all the time for reasons that can't be identified or prepared for in thinking how long is something, how much effort or energy something's going to take us. And that's something you can improve on over time. You make your guesses and you track the actual results. You talk about energy management like we do with clients all the time so that you're predicting not just time, but energy. But there's always going to be things that you can't account for. So sure, build in a buffer. There's nothing wrong with building in a buffer. But if you think a paper is going to take you maybe 4 hours and some, good amount of effort to do, and you have 6 weeks, do you need 6 weeks as a buffer? Like, probably not. Probably if you started it a week in advance, you'd have plenty of buffer, right?
Right.
And again, stressing about it for 6 weeks doesn't make it easier, doesn't make it better. In fact, it makes everything harder because your body is spending resources on that stress.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. Another reason to start early is if it's something where there are no criteria other than just you want it to be as good as you can make it, meaning you want time to be able to iterate. Attempt number one and then a review, and I can do attempt number two and then attempt number three and so on, which is great. That's very rarely the case with somebody assigning you a piece of homework, especially a piece of writing homework. And if it is, just know that what you're then saying is, well, the reason I have to start it early is so that I can work on it for 6 weeks, not so that I can finish it and be done, so that I can iterate and iterate and iterate for 6 weeks. So there
Potentially
are
at the
some,
expense of other things, right?
was that?
Potentially at the expense of other things you need to do or want to do.
Right. Is the final product really going to be all that much better because you iterated for 6 weeks instead? I mean, either way, you're probably going to get the A, right? And it depends on who you are and what you're used to. And, you got to learn yourself and plan around who you are and what you're used to. It's best to start at the last minute with most of this stuff. Pretty much anything that is assigned to you that you don't have a personal interest in doing, you should start last minute. The real work is in figuring out what last minute means so that you're starting accurately at the last minute that you could and still get it done without a problem. Not past that last minute and I'm calling this last minute and I didn't account for something and now it's a problem.
Yeah.
Then you were just wrong about what last minute was. Work on getting better at that, not thinking you shouldn't wait till then. Because if nothing else, let's say you get an assignment that you don't want to do, but it's worth doing because you want the grade and the grade matters for other things and blah, 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 right? Like a lot of what we do, we wouldn't otherwise do, except that it has some benefit later on. Well, if nothing else, the world could get hit by a meteor and everybody could die at any given point. And if the thing is not due for 6 weeks and you spend 2 weeks doing it at the beginning and then the world blows up, are you happy that's how you spent your last 2 weeks?
Right.
And I know that's a ridiculous example, but in a very real world example, how many people had assignments canceled, tests canceled very recently within the last couple of years that they would never have guessed were canceled? Are you happy you spent all that time and effort working on something that it turns out you didn't actually end up needing to do? And another thing, aside from the rest, you prioritize other things, blah, blah, blah. Well, during that time, if you do what we just talked about, where you start looking at what it is you need to do at the beginning, just to make sure that you're set up for whenever you actually do it, your brain isn't idle that whole time. You're thinking about it. You're working on it. Even without putting effort into it, just automatically, you're going to have some times where you notice something and be like, oh, that would be really relevant for this paper that I'm going to be working on that you wouldn't have otherwise noticed. And if you had written the paper before you saw that thing, you don't have that thing now. You will do a better job later than you will earlier because you have more information later than you do earlier.
This goes contrary to everything that we hear in school and college.
Yep. But here's my favorite way to tell if some common wisdom is bunk.
Mm.
If you don't know anybody who does it that way,
right,
then it's bad idea.
Yeah.
And you can tell yourself all you want, neurodivergent people find neurodivergent people. So of course all my friends struggle in the same way that I struggle. But find me anybody who does it that way. Like ask around. Who not only starts it early, but finishes early and then doesn't think about it for the next 4 weeks.
I work at an academic library, and there's a reason we're open 24 hours a day during exam season. And there's a reason we meet people for the first time during exam season, and we don't see them again until the next one.
If a good proportion of us all do something in a particular way, especially if that way is something that we have been told is a bad way, but we do it anyway. If a good proportion of us do it that way, that's pretty solid evidence that there's a reason that that's actually the better way for us to do it. Yeah. And the larger that proportion, up to and including all of us do it this way, even though all of us have been told it's a bad way, there's a reason we do it that way. And it's not because we're all deficient.
No.
And we're all broken. It's because we're being told to do it in a way that either isn't good or literally just doesn't work for us the way that we're constructed. If we all do something, there's a reason. It doesn't always mean that it's better. There are times that we all do something in a certain way, and it would be better for us to learn to do something differently. Otherwise, society and culture and humans wouldn't change over time. Like we do find things like, oh, better to have access to medicine and medical care. Cool. Like let's do that new way, you know. But it's worth checking. Like it's worth, if you notice everybody's struggling to do it the way that you're being told to do it, let's think about why would it, what is the actual reason that it would be good to do it that way we're being told? Not just assume that we all suck with initiation.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we got way off this stuff and we got to get wrapping up here in a minute.
Yeah.
But
Yes,
we had some practical examples in there today.
we did. My takeaway from this is that sometimes it's not self-sabotage. It's that, and that's just a label we have for things we do that we think
Or
we're
it
doing
is.
wrong.
But
Or it
and the
is.
question is, if it is, if you're calling it self-sabotage, why? What's the point? How is that useful to you? And if it's
Yeah.
useful to you, great. If it's not, then it can still be self-sabotage, but you could also call it something else. Keep going until you know, I what is this? It's a pen, it's a writing instrument, it's a cylindrical metal object, yay long, and all of these things are true.
Yeah.
So if you're going to call it self-sabotage, I have no problem with that. Just know that it can be self-sabotage and also executive dysfunction, and also that I don't want to do it, and also a million other things. Just keep, you don't have to throw away any of those. They can all be accurate, but keep going until you find something that actually is useful. And sometimes self-sabotage is a useful way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, that's time.
Yeah.
Good to see you, and
Good to see you, Marie.
I hope your sore throat gets better soon. And
Appreciate that.
yeah. Thanks anybody who's in the chat. Thanks for watching. And if you have any further questions, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook. If you have any comments you'd like to add. And this video will go out again on Wednesday on YouTube and Facebook. And yeah, take care and have a great week, everybody.
Thank you. I'll see you next week.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.